Probably the most dramatic moment of the council was the Declaration on Religious Freedom.
Dignitatis Humanae represented a major development of doctrine.
What Vatican II did was recover a forgotten element of the Church's tradition, the clear distinction between political authority and spiritual authority.
Dignitatis Humanae is saying that the state has no right to coerce people's religious practice. And the problem with that is that it looks as though the 19th century church was calling on the state precisely to coerce on behalf of the Catholic faith.
I really feel that with the 19th century condemnations of religious liberty, it's more deeply motivated by political reaction and fear.
Even in the early church, there are some remarkable articulations of religious freedom that are remarkably similar to what appears in Dignitatis Humanae.
The dignity of man requires that we respect the seeking of truth.
The big change in Christian relationship to the state began actually in the 4th century with the Emperor Constantine. Up until that time, the Christians had been a small, tolerated or persecuted minority. But with Constantine, he not only tolerated Christianity, but favored it.
Pope Gelasius, at the end of the 5th century, said, "Two there are." And he was talking about two swords, the idea of a temporal sword and a spiritual sword. And this idea has persisted in the West ever since. And again, I think it's even in the Middle Ages, when the church was probably at the height of its powers, including temporal powers, it always competed with and balanced against temporal powers like the emperor and various kings.
In the history of the Roman Empire that was baptized under Constantine and so on, that was a period of huge expansion of the Catholic Church. It's also true that there are things that happen there that contradict the gospel. So we make progress in understanding, for example, that using violence to convert people is not evangelical.
One of the big turning points in this church-state relationship occurred in the 16th century, and occurred as part of the Reformation and the so-called Counter-Reformation, the Catholic and Protestant conflict that time. And the only way to make peace in Germany was to say that all these little small German states, the ruler could decide the religion of his lands. So cuius regio, eius religio. He who rules, it's his religion. So there were all these established churches in Christendom. That began to break down with the French Revolution.
The idea of religious freedom brought to the minds of church leaders in the 19th century the idea of religious liberty connected with French revolutionary ideology, with anti-clericalism, with such notions as the belief that religious vows don't bind, or that we should embrace religious indifferentism, not caring about matters of religious faith, or religious relativism, the idea that all faiths were equally true or equally false or whatever.
If you go back to the mid-19th century, Pope Gregory XVI said that following freedom of conscience was a form of insanity. Just about a century later, in 1965, and the council said the respect for the dignity of the person and the freedom of religion that it implies is revealed by the divine word of God and by reason itself. So you've got a rather dramatic difference with the church's position in the mid-19th century and at the council. And needless to say, the development between those positions didn't happen easily.
the Second Vatican Council, one of its last acts, approved a decree on religious liberty known as Dignitatis Humanae. And this decree appears to reverse the previous teaching. But it seems to be problematic from a theological point of view that what the church once held could later on be held to be false or vice versa.
What the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, says is that the Church's task is to read the signs of the times and to interpret them in light of the gospel. The times can change, but what has to remain constant is the light of the gospel that's brought to those signs. So whatever the changes might be that the Church undergoes, we have to be very careful that we don't in any way abandon the gospel. For example, the Church legitimated slavery back for many centuries. And the Church not only taught that torture was legitimate, but it actually practiced torture in the days of the Inquisition. Now, the Second Vatican Council calls torture a crime against God himself. So it's a recognition that this practice is something that really isn't compatible with the gospel in light of new experiences and new ways of understanding the implications of the gospel in new social circumstances. So this is a very tricky process. It isn't easy.
If you look at early modern discussions of the Church's right to coerce, you get the following very, very interesting line of argument. The Pope and the bishops are pastors. They are shepherds. Now, I had a grandfather who was a sheep farmer, and I know that sheep farmers do not go up to the sheep and ask their say-so when wanting to put the sheep somewhere. They get their shepherd's crook and they give the sheep a big push. If you see Christ in the catacombs with the sheep, he's holding a sheep by physical force. And so they say it's obvious that the Church, as an entity on this earth, serving people's most important interest, their eternal salvation, is ruled by shepherds who, like any shepherd, must be able to use corrective force. Again, all this stuff is now invisible in the modern Church. But if you're going to tell a story about continuity at the level of the Church's own self-conception, that was deep at the heart of Benedict XVI's interpretation of Vatican II, you're going to have to deal with all this stuff.
The Church had an obligation to protect its own and also to try to get others to join and to give up their evil ways. And if you just said, well, it's okay, whatever you do, whatever you believe, and so forth, well, so was the Church really living up to its obligations? So I think that was an argument, a deep argument that was used. There was a famous line of St. Augustine in dealing with the Donatist heresy in the 4th and 5th century, and it was compellere intrare, make them come in. So Augustine advocated the state putting pressure on the Donatists to become Catholics.
Religious wars are a standard part of the narrative, what I call the secular liberal narrative, which says that you can only have liberal democracy emerging in history when Christianity is sidelined and marginalized. But I think Christianity is absolutely critical in introducing the notion of freedom into the discourse of politics and philosophy in the West. The Apostle Paul's notion of a person being free in Christ, the notion that through Christ we're free from sin, that the Christian faith can only be chosen freely out of one's conscience. I think that this is key for introducing the idea of freedom into society.
The church never defended the legitimacy of religious coercion. What it did defend was saying that people who believed something that the church judged to be wrong couldn't practice it publicly. That's what the church conceived of earlier on, that having Catholicism as the official religion of the state was something needed for the common good of the society. Therefore, it should be insisted upon as there should be a state religion, namely Catholicism. It was recognized, though, in the 20th century, and especially at the Council, that this was not necessary as a condition for the flourishing of Catholicism. As a matter of fact, it was recognized that this kind of restriction on freedom was really counterproductive for the church.
Of course, the great horrid event of the 20th century was the Second World War. But like all horrid events, it had some interesting repercussions and consequences.
People came to understand that religious freedom didn't necessarily mean the French Revolutionary conception of religious freedom. There was an alternative understanding promoted, for example, by the great American Jesuit theologian, John Courtney Murray, that one found, for example, in the American Revolution and in American constitutionalism, and made it possible for the Church in Dignitatis Humanae to in fact embrace a robust conception of religious freedom, going beyond the simple idea that faith must be free and can't be coerced, to endorse the idea that people need to be free, consistently with their dignity. People need to be free to be able to advocate, to express their beliefs in the public square, even if those beliefs were incorrect.
If we look at the contents of this document of the Second Vatican Council, in continuity with the gospel of Jesus Christ, we see that this content of the Second Vatican Council is much closer to the idea of what a community of faithful is according to the gospel than to what the popes of the 19th century said. It all depends with what kind of church teachings we want to be in continuity.
It's very hard to do a very convincing reconciliation between 19th century teaching and 20th century post-Vatican II teaching if you think that all that the Church has ever been teaching about is the authority of the state. Because it does look as though different things are being said. An alternative route, which is the one I favour, is to say, well look, the religiously coercive authority was never the state anyway. It was always the Church. If you look at it that way, then it's perfectly possible for the Church at a certain date to say, for very good reasons, which one could discuss further, we don't want you to do this coercing anymore. Of course, once the Church says that, you have no right to coerce, and people have a right not to be coerced by you.
I think one of the most dramatic events during the time of the Second Vatican Council was in 1965 when Pope Paul VI came to the United Nations to address the United Nations. He commends the United Nations for its defense of human rights, and especially the right to religious liberty. Now that would have been inconceivable for a pope to make that statement 4 years earlier.
One can still hope for a Catholic country where maybe even you have an established church. Like Poland, for instance, is aspiring to be like this. But if you have an established church, meaning that the state upholds the church, maybe it sponsors it, maybe it enshrines it in the Constitution as the official church and so forth, you also have to have religious freedom.
To put coercive state power behind the Church's proclamation of the gospel is to, tacitly at least, make the assumption that the gospel does not have the power to be effective on its own.
That doesn't mean that the state is no longer concerned with the ultimate end of man, it means that the state is no longer the source. The state is not the source of that.
Democracy presupposes virtuous citizens, but democracy itself cannot produce virtuous citizens. We need a government that will respect the autonomy and authority and integrity of the institutions of civil society, above all the family and the church. And we need the family and the church then to do their jobs in producing virtuous citizens who are capable of self-government.
The most important thing is the fundamental notion that when human beings unite into political society, they don't somehow shed their religious beliefs. But I think that especially Americans are too apt to say, well, really, the free market in religion is what most healthy for a religion. The truth does not always win out in the competition for religious ideas.
As you secularize, so you will get a declining reliability with which people understand and grasp, let alone adhere to the natural law. And of course, one very, very important area is the whole debate about marriage. The Church has tried, within a context of religious neutrality at the political level, to defend natural law teaching on marriage, and it has to be said that it's been comprehensively failing. Increasingly we're seeing public opinion, except amongst devout churchgoers, moving in a direction of toleration of gay marriage. So it seems to me we've got, out of Vatican II, we get a very interesting experiment into whether a particular reading of Dignitatis Humanae, not part of its official teaching, I think, but a reading of it, the replacement of a previous ideal of church-state unity with a new ideal of religious neutrality, whether this is feasible, whether it's actually going to work in the context of the state's duty to uphold the natural law.
For someone to argue that something bad happened because of Dignitatis Humanae, I would ask them, look at the Soviet Union, look at South Africa, look at Central America, look at Latin America, and you say you want to go back to the way it used to be? I'm sorry, that's a big mistake.